Hi, everybody. Welcome. How's everybody doing? Yay. So great to see you all. I'm Stephanie Singer. I'm the Director of Arts and Ideas. And on behalf of the JCCSF, it's my honor and delight to welcome you to this evening's program, The Odyssey, with Daniel Mendelsohn and Robert Alter. We are so excited to see you. Thank you all so much for coming. The JCCSF has been part of the beautiful tapestry of San Francisco civic life for nearly 150 years. Urban and inclusive, we create spaces where people of all ages, backgrounds, and identities can find a place for lifelong learning, friendship, and a sense of belonging through preschool, summer camps, fitness and swim lessons, social programs for older adults, and cultural arts programs like tonight's. A few words of gratitude before we get started. Our sincere thanks to our partners this evening, Cleo's Books of Oakland, and our fiercely independent bookstore partner, Green Apple Books. Yay! Everyone, give a wave to Barbara in the back. Daniel will be signing books immediately after the conversation in the back of the hall, so please stick around for that portion of the evening. Baklava Story, for providing the delicious dessert reception to come. We always say around here, yes, cookies do matter. JCCSF staff for their hard work and dedication and for pulling together each day to make us shine. We see you. Board members past and present for your leadership, wise counsel, and time. Donors, as a nonprofit organization, we wouldn't be here without your contributions, and we thank you deeply for supporting the meaningful work that we do here. And for anyone who's not currently a supporter, if you can, please consider the JCCSF in your philanthropic plans. And most of all, you. We want to thank you all for being here tonight with us, with each other in person and in community. This is kind of droopy. Tonight, we welcome Daniel Mendelsohn back to the JCCSF for a discussion of his new book, or really I should say an old book, because it's a translation of the Odyssey by Homer, an ancient text that's captured people's imaginations for nearly 3,000 years. With his new Odyssey, Daniel Mendelsohn eschews the streamlining and modernizing approach of many recent translations, focusing instead on the epic's formal qualities in order to bring it to life in all its archaic grandeur. The result is a magnificent feat of translation, one that conveys the poetics of the original while bringing to vivid life the gripping adventure, profound human insight, and powerful themes that make Homer's work continue to resonate today. Memoirist, critic, translator, and frequent contributor of essays to The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books, where he's editor-at-large, Daniel Mendelsohn is the author of 10 books, including the international bestsellers The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, winner of the National Jewish Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award, and An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, an NPR and Kirkus Best Book of the Year. His other honors include the Prix Medici in France and the Premio Malaparte, Italy's highest honor for foreign writers. In 2022, he was made a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres by the Republic of France. He is currently the Charles Ranlett Flint Professor of Humanities at Bard College. Joining Daniel for this truly epic conversation is Robert Alter, Emeritus Professor and OG of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley, and the award-winning author of more than 24 books, including 2 prize-winning volumes on biblical narrative and poetry, award-winning translations of Genesis and the 5 books of Moses, and his seminal 3-volume translation of the Hebrew Bible. Please join me in giving Daniel and Bob a very warm welcome back to the JCCSF.
Well, Daniel, I'd like to begin with something rather amazing, and I'm curious what you make of this. Before I dove into the translation proper, which I I think it's a superb translation. I recommend it to everybody in this room. I hope I get a cut of the royalties for that. um, I read your translator's introduction, and what I discovered was that the principles that were guiding you, that you spelled out, were pretty much point for point the principles that guided me in translating the Hebrew Bible. In fact, I did this mental experiment. I said, wait a minute, I could have used this introduction simply substituting biblical examples for the Homeric example. And I'll just spell that out before you respond, spell out the main points. You note that you favored Anglo-Saxon vocabulary in English because it's compact and these are really everyday words in a way. You avoided any kind of locution that sounded very modern. Then I don't think you said this, but you do it in the translation. You give a tactfully discreet antique coloration to the English. That is using a good deal of syntactic inversion and using words that are still current in English, but we hardly use them, like trencher. Probably half the people in the room don't know what a trencher is. I used casement in the same way. And then, of course, you go to great efforts to be faithful to the poetic form, even the prosody of the Greek. And I did the same for the English, for the Hebrew. So I wonder what do you think about that?
Well, I'll thank you. I'll start out by saying that, first of all, it's just an incredible pleasure and an honor for me to be here sitting next to Robert Alter. I always think of myself as a accidental translator who sort of backed into two translations, but I never think of myself as a professional, and it's a kind of awesome thing for me to be sitting here with you, Bob, who is one of the great translators of the past 50 years. So that means a lot to me, and I was very pleased when you communicated to me earlier on by email that we had the same basic approach, because I thought I must be doing something right, even if in my case it's accidental. So I do. So when we were just backstage noshing on our pita bread, and I was thinking we're both basically have the same challenge, which is we're both taking these extremely old texts that have been translated many times by other people, and in both cases, general readers are accustomed to a certain way of hearing these texts, right? In the case of the Bible, there are certain established translations that we get so used to that we stop thinking of them almost as translations. To take an obvious example for most people, not necessarily just of the Hebrew Bible, but the King James Bible has worked its way into the imagination of English-speaking people.
Sure.
And that there are phrases from that are so natural to us, even though it's a rather antiquated diction, say. And in the case of Homer, there are certain translations which have sort of made themselves felt over the years, or have become so authoritative that we are used to them. So an example that, as you know, I talk about quite often in my translator's note, there are phrases from Homer like the wine-dark sea and winged words and gray-eyed Athena, these epithets, swift-footed Achilles, that have we're so used to them. And I think we're both engaged in the same project, which is to try to sort of go back to the mind that created these works, and the creation of these works in both of our cases is a complicated question. At least I don't have to deal with the issue that God wrote the Odyssey, so at least I don't have to struggle with that. But these things have become kind of fossilized in a way. And so what do these things actually mean? So, for example, I spent a lot of time in my introduction talking about winged words, which is something that is a phrase that has worked its way into English. But as I explained, just to give you one example so when I started translating, I thought, well, Homer, we're so used to Homer in a certain way, and he's been translated in so many different ways by so many different people, some in a very archaic way, some in a very modern, slangy way, but at the end of the day, he's a poet, and he's a poet with whoever he is. All of this is in quotation marks. He has a style, and I think there's a certain obligation to respect the style of the poet, right? But in the case of winged words, for example, when I really started to think, well, what is this phrase? It's a phrase in Greek, right? An adjectival phrase. And when people get very worked up in either the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer will say, and then Odysseus spoke with winged words. And it's a phrase that's typically used when someone's speaking with great emotion. And I started looking at the Greek. So when I think of winged words, I think of words with little wings attached, like the elephants in Fantasia, And I got so used to the phrase, but I thought, what does this actually mean? And I started, and what the Greek actually says is that they have feathers, right? That the word pteroenta in Greek means feathered. And then I started doing some research, and there's a very interesting German article from the beginning of the 20th century who had the same kind of impulse that I was having. And he looked at it, and it's obvious that what Homer was thinking about was not words flying around on little wings like Dumbo, but he was actually thinking of the fletching on arrows, so that the words are darting at you like arrows, right? So that's just one example of the way in which, as you do, trying to sort of peel away the accretions of received other translations that have sort of built up over time, and to really think, well, what was this, right? So the other thing that you were mentioning, Bob, was English is a very rich language because we have basically two ancestral strains, right? We have the Anglo-Saxon or Germanic strain, and we have the Latinate strain. So as you mentioned, in my translation, and you do this too, I thought this is a very ancient poem. It felt very primal to the Greeks. It felt very ancient and august to them. And so whenever I had a choice between a sort of Latinate word and an Anglo-Saxon word, I always went with the Anglo-Saxon-ish word. So it's not something you necessarily are aware of as you're reading, but the cumulative effect is that it feels more primal, right? So I always say, think of the difference between justice and right, right? Right is a much more primal word in English. Justice comes trailing a whole Latinate tradition. So those are sort of I think we're on the same wavelength, in trying to sort of look at these ancient works and restore to them kind of qualities. So I avoided slanginess and up-to-date locutions just because it's not how it feels to me. I always say, look, it's a free country. Well, for the time being. And, there's no rules about this, there's no laws about this, but for me, these are the things that I wanted to bring out.
Well, I'm struck by what you say about sort of scrubbing away all the accreted layers of received translations. And I'm going to give, there were a few of these in what I did with the Hebrew that are close to or even go beyond what you do with winged words. For example, my translation of the Hebrew Bible is soulless. There's no soul. I don't think there's a soul in Homeric Greek. Is it? Well, anyway, you can respond to that in a minute.
I'm thinking about it.
The word that's always translated as soul is it means life breath, and by extension, it means a number of other things. Now, one of the surprising extensions is that by metonymy, I'll explain that. Metonymy is when you compare two things because they're in contact, not because they're similar. Like in Damon Runyon, American, calling a pretty girl a skirt. She doesn't look like a skirt, but she's wearing a skirt. So one of the extensions by metonymy of nefesh is that it means throat, because the throat is the passageway for the life breath, right? And there's this beautiful line, which everybody translates it this way, in one of the Psalms. My soul thirsts for you, O God, in a parched land without water. And I looked at that and I said, that's not right. I mean, look at the context. It's a parched land without water. So I translated, my throat thirsts for you, which is a little shocking. It's not as beautiful as my soul search, but it has to do with the physicality of biblical spirituality. Right. So you probably ran into similar things.
Well, yeah, there are always things where, the thing about translation you always have to remember is that it's not a matter of, you start on line 1. The Odyssey is a poem of 12,110 lines, right? And it's not like you say, okay, I'm going to start my translation today. I'm going to get out my dictionary and I'm going to start on line 1, and there's a word in Greek and you find a corresponding English word, right? That's not actually how it works, because as you're suggesting with your example from the Psalms, there's a kind of cloud of associations around these words in the original language. Then you often have a series of choices about which parts of the cloud you're going to be using, right? So it's not just that there's a one-to-one correspondence, that's the thing. So so before I gave an example of the Anglo-Saxon and the right. Latinate tradition, and I used justice versus right. So there's a word in Greek, themis. Themis, and it comes up in the Odyssey in very strange contexts, means it's sort of like justice, which is sometimes how it's translated, but I would never translate it as justice, because the th in themis is connected to one of the most ancient of all Greek words. As in English, Greek has words that are older than other words, right? That has to do with placing something, putting something down, right? So so when you see the word themis in Greek, you know that it has to do with right or justice, but it really means to establish something, to set something down, right? So when you come across that word, you don't even want to say right? I did not rehearse that, but But you see what I mean? So you have to think, right? It's about placing something. It's about establishing something as the way things ought to be because you've set it down on the ground. So, what do you do with that? And so you can play with that in all different ways. But there were many times where you think. So to take a different kind of example, one of the most famous epithets in Homer, which everyone knows, even if you haven't read the Odyssey or the Iliad, which I hope you will do after tonight, is the wine dark sea. Everybody's heard that phrase, the wine dark sea, and it said, "Oh, that's so nice, the wine dark sea."
Yeah.
So, this is one of those, moments where, and you think, "Oh, we're so used to it, right?" I thought, what on earth does this actually mean? Because what the Greek word actually is, and the Odyssey in particular is a poem about the sea, right? The poor guy is schlepping along on the sea for 10 years trying to get home, and he's shipwrecked, and he's he thinks very early on in his adventures he's so close to Ithaca that he can see the smoke rising from the evening fires, and then his fakakta crew makes a mistake and they get washed back, and he's another 9 years before he gets home, right? So it's a poem about the sea, and so this term comes up a lot, right? The wine dark sea, the wine dark sea. And we're also used to it. What does it mean? What the actual Greek adjective is wine-faced. It has a face like wine. It's just a compound adjective. Oinops, right? Ops means your face, and oinos is wine. It's actually it's in the word enophile. The eno in enophile is the same as oinos, right? So oinops means having a face of wine. Okay, well, that doesn't help at all. What on earth does that mean? Right? And so is it, is it like a California Cabernet? Is it a delightful, saucy little, Syrah? I don't, So I'm thinking, what does it mean? And sometimes I have to say you can get out of these problems by not doing anything. So I thought, does that mean are there any people here of Greek descent? Anyone? So any Greek people refer to wine still today. We say red and white, but the Greeks say black and white. You can order black wine or white wine. And I thought, what on earth is this guy thinking of, right? But does it mean it's what your face looked like after you've had a lot of wine? Is it shiny? Is it dark? Is it glistening, right? And so what I finally did is I just translated it as wine-faced. And I thought, let you deal with it. But because it's actually quite beautiful, right? The wine-faced sea, why there's an impulse, I think, sometimes in translation to explain what things mean. But remember, this is poetry. It's not ordinary language to begin with. So why explain something away when it's actually quite beautiful? It's a little bit mysterious, right? So you're dealing with a cast of mind which is different to ours, and I think sometimes the right approach is to let the strangeness remain instead of trying to. I think that's always a temptation, particularly with very ancient work.
Yeah.
That what he means is, but I'm not so sure it was clear to the Greeks.
Well, actually, I agree with you about explanation. In my translator's introduction, I faulted modern translations of the Bible for what I call the heresy of explanation.
Yeah.
They want to make everything super clear when in the original it's not necessarily clear.
Right. Although there are times when you need to. So my translation comes with a very full notes and commentary at the back, because there are first of all, there are some things that are untranslatable. Mm-hmm. So then you just throw up your hands and do a note, but
I know about that.
I know. You know from notes, But so, for example, there's a very famous example in the Odyssey. And I think a lot of people know this story, again, even if you haven't read the Odyssey, because so many of the stories from the Odyssey have entered the Western imagination that we know about the Cyclops and the Lotus Eaters and Scylla and Charybdis, even if we haven't read it. So, a very famous incident when Odysseus finds himself trapped in a cave of a one-eyed giant called Cyclops. And he's a kind of suspicious character. And so when he first enters the cave and the Cyclops asks him his name, he says, "Oh, my name is No One." Right? And that's a very complicated pseudonym for Odysseus, because part of his problem is he's been gone so long from home that he actually is a no one at that point. So it's a lie, but it's also true in a way. Everyone thinks he's dead, right? So he is kind of a no one. So he said, "My name is No One," just to hedge his bets. And as it turns out, he gets trapped in the cave. The Cyclops starts eating his sailors. And at a certain moment, he gets the Cyclops drunk. The Cyclops passes out. While the Cyclops is passed out, he pokes his eye out. And the Cyclops starts screaming. And the Cyclops neighbors, the other Cyclops people, come running to the cave of the Cyclops, and they say, "What's wrong? Is anyone hurting you?" And he says, "No one is hurting me." And so they all go home, and they say, "Well, if no one is hurting you, we'll go back home." Right? So that's the joke. But it's actually much more complicated. So that you can do in a translation. You just capitalize "no one," right? And there's sort of a complicated thing going on, because the Greek word for no one is outis, which is sort of how you might say the name of Odysseus if you were drunk, which he is, So it's a sort of doubly compounded, jokey name. But when the other Cyclops come running, they say, "Is anyone hurting?" Right? So in English, it works the same. Anyone, no one, right? Is anyone hurting you? And the answer is no one, right? Is anyone home? No one is home. So the Greek word for anyone, so I just told you that the Greek word for no one is outis. The Greek word for anyone in this particular sentence is metis. So they ask the question, "Is metis hurting you?" And he says, "No, outis is hurting me." Is anyone hurting you? No one is hurting. It just so happens that the word metis in Greek not only means no one or anyone in this case, it means cunning intelligence. So they're also saying, "Is cunning intelligence hurting you?" And the answer to that question is yes, right? And there's no way to do that in English. So you just have to write a note. Sometimes you just hit a wall because the original is untranslatable. And I think you do yourself more harm trying to sort of twist yourself in knots, and just, you have to admit there's only so much you can do.
But since you spoke a couple of minutes ago about the wine-faced sea, which I like, I can't resist pointing out to the audience that the Greek oinos is a word shared with biblical Hebrew.
Yeah.
That is, yayin is the same word.
Yeah.
There's
related.
trade going on in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, one of the things we know about the origins of the Iliad and the Odyssey remain, even now, very obscure. We really can only guess at how these immensely long and incredibly artful and unbelievably intricately structured poems, the Iliad is even longer than the Odyssey, actually. It's 15,000 lines, came into being. But we do know that the Odyssey, we have very good reasons to believe that the Odyssey came into being, or sort of coalesced in its final form after sort of evolving over many generations, just at the moment when there was a rising amount of trade in the Mediterranean between the Greek mainland, the Greek islands, the Phoenicians, the Middle East. And there are a lot of stories in the Odyssey about Egypt. And, the Odyssey is a poem that's very interested in other places, which most people weren't. You know, I mean, travel was difficult. No one wanted to leave home in ancient times. You know, it was weird. The Egyptians sat there for 4,000 years and they never got off their tuchuses, you know. I mean, so it's interesting that you said that, because it's interesting because the Odyssey, of course, all kidding aside, is so interested in travel and meeting new civilizations and exchanging. You know, Odysseus is the first character in the Western tradition, certainly in the classical tradition, who is a kind of tour. You know, he goes places not just because he has to, but because he's interested. You know, he'll go to an island and he'll say, and you know, his sailors say, you know, let's leave. You know, things are looking a little suspicious, and Odysseus says, no, let's hang around, let's see who the people are, let's talk to them. You know, so it is interesting because it is a poem about travel and the excitement of a new world in which there was for the first time a lot of exchange between civilizations.
Now, I'm going to ask you a different question, which stems from an experience I had in connection with my translation. I had this very gifted young woman, an Israeli graduate student, who's now teaching in Haifa, who is a poet and knows English poetry extremely well. So when my translation came out, there was an event for it in Jerusalem, and she was one of the people who spoke. And then she said something which had never occurred to me. She said, the way you translate biblical poetry looks to me like it was influenced by plain language poets in English, like William Carlos Williams, maybe Robert Frost, Seamus Heaney. And I had never thought of them, but maybe there was some kind of subliminal connection. So are there English poets or other kinds of English writers that you think got into your translation?
Well, I don't know if there are English poets. You know, as some of you know, I had done a translation of Constantine Cavafy,
Right.
the Alexandrian Greek poet, and which in a weird way, even though he's a modern poet, right, was a good preparation for this, because on the one hand, he writes a very plain, everyday Greek, but it has a lot of weirdness about it. And that's sort of what Homer is like,
Yeah.
you know. I mean, one of the thing you have to understand about Homer's Greek is that no one ever spoke it. So it's a purely artificial literary language that was only used for poetry. No one actually ever spoke this language. It's an amalgam of different dialects of Greek from different eras in the evolution of the Greek language, right? So there's sort of no model for it really before or after. I mean, it's just sui generis. And I'm not so sure. I mean, I read a lot of poetry, and I think what I was really thinking about, the challenge of translating Homer is that the original feels it has a lot of contradictory qualities. So on the one hand, it's very, as I just said, it's not real Greek. So it's a purely artistic language. On the other hand, it feels very natural. It's archaic, but it's actually quite swift moving. You know, the lines move along. They're not crunchy. I always say, some of you who read the Iliad in college or whatever may have run across the Richmond Lattimore translation of the Iliad, which I always like to say is only slightly harder than the original. You know, because he's trying to reconstruct this sort of archaic, crunchy quality. You know, so it manages to be a lot of contradictory things at the same time. The original, when you read it in Greek, it's archaic, but it moves fast. It's very plain, but it's also very artful, you know. So when you're translating into English, you have to sort of choose which one of the qualities you're going to go with, because there's no way of doing all those things in English. So I think, you know, when you're talking about plain language poetry, you know, there are certain poets who were very important to me at different points in my life. And you named one of them, which is Robert Frost. Whitman is another one. And I thought the quality that I wanted to bring across from the original, or one of the strands of the Homeric DNA, is the plainness, that it's everyone, like Joe Greek in Periclean Athens, or Jane Greek, understood Homer, even though it was completely not at all the language they spoke. And here again, I'm going to recur to my example of the King James Bible. When we hear phrases from the King James Bible, they feel totally natural to us, even though no one talks like that. So that's a rough kind of example. But I wanted to me, the plainness of Homer is dignified. He's never fancy. He's never high. He's never, T.S. Eliot is much more fancy than Homer.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So that, to me, I think, was the paramount thing I wanted to be. So I may have unconsciously be influenced by various English language poets who tend to be plain spoken. But as you mentioned, I was also interested in sort of, I always say, putting a pea under the mattress. Right, that it shouldn't feel totally normal. It can feel plain, but sometimes I play with the syntax, so I twist things a little so it's not quite normal English syntax, just to always remind you that this is not everyday speech. Even though it's simple, it's not normal, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Now, I fully identify with what you say about the plainness. That is, it's not understood by a lot of people that plainness can be eloquent.
Yeah.
And I know in translation of the Bible, modern ones, they kind of tart up the Hebrew because they figure it's too plain.
Right.
So, say in the flood narrative, the ark was on the face of the waters 40 days and 40 nights. Was not floated, not
Just
sailed.
was. It just
or
was.
anything else.
Right.
And that's beautiful.
Right. Was it a wine face? That's something you can add.
Same sea. Okay, I'm going to ask you to do something which might bewilder our audience, except I'm sure you can explain it lucidly.
Okay.
More than any other translations of Homer that I've read, you tried to follow the prosodic form of the Greek poetry.
The
Could
rhythm.
you talk about that a little bit?
So all ancient epic, Homer, even both Greek and Latin, all epic is written in the same rhythm, the same meter, which is called dactylic hexameter. So I always say that sounds like a diagnosis. And dactylic hexameter just means, the hex in hexameter means there are 6 units in each line. And the unit is called a dactyl. So dactyl is the ancient Greek word for finger, right? And like pterodactyl, right? The patera, oh, you're going to love this. The patera in pterodactyl is the same word as feathers in the word I was talking about before. So actually, what that creature from Jurassic Park is a feather wing, is a feather finger. That's what the word actually means. So a dactyl, the unit is 1 long beat and 2 short beats, like a half note and 2 quarter notes. That's all it means. And the reason it comes from the Greek word for finger is that your finger has 1 long bone and 2 short bones, right? So 1 dactyl is papa, right? That's all it is. And you string 6 of those together, and that's the standard line of all classical epic poetry. Only epic uses that. So a typical line of Homer, and there's usually a break about halfway through the line, which is obvious a place where the person who was reciting this had to take a breath. I just recorded the audiobook, and I can tell you, you have to take a breath, right? You can't, because theoretically it's an 18-syllable line, right? 6 times 3, right? It's a three beat line, and there are 6 of them. And that's very hard to get through. So the rhythm of a typical line of Homeric Greek goes like this. Bum, and you're going to hear the papa kind of rhythm, right? Bum, 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 breath. Bum, 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 bum. The last line usually only consists of two beats to end the line. Bum, 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 bum. That's a long line, right? And the problem facing the translator is that, or the delightful thing, if you study Greek, is that Greek, as much as I love English, and we both love English, has a very complicated and unbelievably highly developed verbal system. So an example is that what in English, say, if you wanted to express the idea to the women who are about to be married, that's one word in Greek. So you've got a very long line filled with words that are working overtime, right? Because we need a whole line just to say to the women who are about to be married. Mm-hmm. And that's just one word, right? So the issue facing the translator is, what are you going to do? Now, the typical rhythm, and here I'm thinking particularly of Robert Frost, but also Browning, who is another great favorite of mine, a sort of standard rhythm for a lot of English verse is what we call the iambic pentameter or blank verse. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Right, a lot of Shakespeare is like that, Browning, Frost, certainly, that's a natural rhythm for English. Every language has its own rhythms. So I wanted to do a line-for-line translation because I thought it would be helpful for teachers, when you're reading like articles about Homer, it'll say book 3, line 162. And it's nice to be able to go to book 3 in my translation and find line 162, and it's exactly the same line that's happening in the Greek. But the issue, as you can tell, is one of mathematics, right? If you're going to do a line-for-line translation, you can't take bum, 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 and squeeze it into ba-dum, 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 without losing something. So you understand the issue? It's math. It's just math. It has nothing to do with literature. So I did something that is fairly unusual, especially now. Most translations of classical poetry will use the shorter English line, but because of the discrepancy I was just describing, they'll use 2 or even 3 lines of that short line for each line of Homer in order to get everything that Homer says.
Or take things out.
Or you have to cut, right? Or you have to cut something. So I thought, and this was, but it's interesting, Bob, because it was ultimately an aesthetic decision. To me, that long rolling line, which I've now hummed for you 3 times, is part of the feel of Homer. It's not, just the package, but it's part of the feel, especially, if I may say, it's a poem, as I've said before, about the sea. And that rolling surf-like line is really an important part of the experience. Also, the length of it was part of the epic, was considered the most important form of poetry to the ancients. We think of epic and we think of size, but the ancients had a slightly different orientation. They thought it was about import, right? Epics were epic because they were about important subjects. They were about important subjects. And part of the importance of epic is that long line. This is serious business. And I felt that was such an essential part of the style of Homer that I wasn't willing to shorten it, basically, even using 3 lines for each line of Homer. So I worked a long time on developing, it's not a totally precise imitation of Homer's line, but it's a 6-beat line that's quite long, because I just thought that was incredibly important to the feel of it, that so the opening lines of the Odyssey in my translation, tell me the tale of a man, Muse, who had so many roundabout ways, end of line, to wander, driven off course after sacking Troy's holy keep. There's that pulsating, lulling rhythm is part of the experience. So, that was just important to me. Look, it's not important to everyone, and people achieve wonderful effects by doing things totally different. I remember once I reviewed for the New York Times Book Review a translation of the Iliad by Stanley Lombardo. It was a wonderful translator who works out of the University of Kansas, I think it is. And he has a very short line, a sort of 4-beat line. It isn't even a 5-beat line like the English line I was just going on about. But it's very strong and it's quite impressive. So there's always all different ways to do it. But to me, that was just such a non-negotiable part of the business, and it feels different. But I can now say, having recorded the audiobook, it's hard. It's hard. These guys must have had diaphragms like, I mean, it's because remember, these were chanted and accompanied by music in their original performance. They were performed to a stringed instrument. So it wasn't just, we think of poetry as something you read silently to yourself, but the Greeks would have found that unimaginable. Right? Everything is performed. So I think this is all part of that,
Let me just compliment what you say by what I try to do with biblical poetry. Now, it definitely has a formal structure. It's very different from the Greek. There's no required number of syllables, stressed and unstressed, or long and short. But rhythmically, most lines of biblical poetry have the same number of beats in each half the line. And I tried to replicate that. Now, in order for it not to sound terrible in English, I also tamped down the English language, using monosyllables from Anglo-Saxon origin, leaving out words that didn't seem strictly necessary. And it isn't 100% consistent all the way through, but it works like this. Like, say, a line in Isaiah, I'll stop in the middle, I'm going to recite it in Hebrew, sounds like this from chapter 1 of Isaiah. Hoi goy chote, pause, keved avon. So you hear 3 beats in each half of the line. And I did it, woe offending people, a nation weighed down with sin.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you find ways to sort of bring over the effects that
Right,
you're
without
interested
being
in.
a
But I mean, what we're not talking about is, what I always say, the babies you have to throw out of the lifeboat, right? So you're going to make sacrifices to get the effects that you're interested in.
Absolutely.
Something is going to go out the window. You can't, it's always, there are going to be sacrifices, right? There are always going to be. So in my translation, I have a lot of monosyllabic English words. And, so a purist could say, well, Greek is actually very polysyllabic. Right. The monosyllables are actually quite rare in Greek. So, you at the end of the day, it's not an exact science. It's a matter of taste, what your priorities are. and that's the best that you can do. But I do think saying that, it's interesting to hear you say that a lot. I always want to ask about rhyme in here. I think of the 23rd Psalm, Binot desha yarbitseni al memenuchot yenachaleni. I always think you very rarely get rhyme in Homer, but when it happens, it's kind of exciting.
Yeah, it's ad hoc though.
Yeah, right. But so you do the best you can, and then you wait for the reviews. What can I tell you?
Right. And I like the fact that you use
angry people you offended at a cocktail party 20 years ago.
No, I like the fact that you use the word sacrifice, 'cause I felt that very strongly.
Yeah.
That translation of a great work of literature is a matter of constant sacrifice. Sometimes the sacrifices are really painful,
Yeah.
and you can't figure out what else to do. Other times there's kind of moderate sacrifices, and you're happy with what you've done.
Yeah, I think that everybody understands that. I mean, the thing also, I think, is always very important, and we're two people who are working on not only ancient texts, but unbelievably, almost scarily authoritative texts. So the stakes are very high, so to speak, probably more so in your case than in my case, but what I wonder if you feel this, Bob, but I'm aware that, translations compared to the original always have a short shelf life, right? Ultimately, even as you're doing it, you realize that it's not going to last that long in the grand scheme of things, precisely because the modern language, the living language, keeps evolving. So, it's funny, I just published this piece last month in the New Yorker about a new translation of the Roman poet Catullus. And, I was looking at translations, actually by Peter Green, that are only, 25 years old, and they already start to feel a little bit dated because English keeps moving on and the original is fixed, right? So that's, the sort of poignancy of translation, That may be a good note to end on.
Yeah, I think so.
The unwinnable battle. I know that we are encouraging questions, and Stephanie is going to.
Okay. I'm going to start right here in the front.
Great. Oh, thanks. Just because I don't know ancient Greek, and maybe a lot of people here don't, I
Really?
was just wondering whether you could give us a few lines from Homer, or from memory, or I have your text here if you want, but just so we can also just hear you sounded out what the line sounds like, but just to hear some of the words. I ask you because many years ago I read the Iliad in English, and I happened to have a roommate who went to a Catholic school, and he read some of the Iliad in Greek, and he recited, I think, the opening few lines, and I found it extraordinary just to hear.
I think the best way to do it is to give you the English first and then do the Greek. So the first, say, 5 lines. Tell me the tale of a man, muse, who had so many roundabout ways to wander, driven off course after sacking Troy's holy keep. Many the peoples whose cities he saw and whose ways of thinking he learned. Many the toils he suffered at sea, anguish in his heart as he struggled to safeguard his life and the homecoming of his companions. But he could not save his companions even so, though he longed to, for their heedlessness destroyed them, theirs and nobody else's, fools that they were, like children who ate of the sun god Hyperion's cattle, and so he took from them the day of their homecoming. Start where you will, goddess, daughter of Zeus, tell the tale to us too. So that's the first 10 lines of the Odyssey, the so-called proem, the section where the poet announces what he's going to say. And in Greek, it's Andramoi enepe musa, polytropon, hos malapola plangthe, epe troie sieron toliethron epersen. Polon danthropon, iden astea kai noon egno. Polodogen pontoi, pathen algea, hon katathumon, arnumenos hente psychen kai noston hetairon. Al udhos hetairus erusato hiemenos per. Autongar sveteresin atastaliesin alonto nepioi hoi katabus hyperionos elioio estion. Autor hotoisin aphelete nostimon emar. Ton hamothengethea thugater dios epe kahemin. So that's how it sounds in Greek. But you can hear, I hope you can hear that rhythm, right? That rhythm, that sort of it keeps pulsing along, right? And you get into that rhythm. It's quite beautiful, I think, but I'm used to it. Yes, other questions?
Thank you. Do you plan on translating the Iliad?
No.
And if so, it's a shame. I was going to ask what challenges would be different in translating the Iliad than the Odyssey.
No, I'll never translate the Iliad, even if they offered me a lot of money, which they won't. The issue is, first of all, I mean, the issue is a practical one, which is the reason I was asked to do a translation of the Odyssey, which is that the University of Chicago Press, which has the most prestigious series of translations of Greek and Latin classics, particularly Greek, in this country, never had an Odyssey. So Richmond Lattimore, whom I mentioned before, who, all kidding aside, his translation of the Iliad, which was published in the 50s, is now, like the Scott Moncrief Proust, become a classic in its own right. I mean, it's revered as a beautiful thing in its own right. He did the Iliad for Chicago and was supposed to do an Odyssey for them, but he changed publishers. So when he did his Odyssey, it was brought out by a commercial publisher. So they never had an Odyssey to accompany this august and very famous Iliad translation. And so they asked me. So no one needs another Iliad, basically. I wouldn't do it for another more important reason, which is that everyone in classics knows that you're either an Iliad person or an Odyssey person. And that is a matter of temperament. And I'm definitely an Odyssey person, right? Not to say I don't love the Iliad. I teach it, I talk about it, but I think you need to feel when you're translating that you have a tremendous sympathetic relationship to the text, or else you don't just do it as a challenge, you know? And the other thing that I'll say, which is something that nobody in classics likes to talk about, is when you look at them in Greek, it's like works by two totally different authors. You know, we think of Homer, quote unquote, but the Greek is different, the vocabulary is different. It's a whole other ballgame. So I am not tempted. I just don't think I would do it. But I mean, it's nice of you to offer. But but I'll have to say no. You know. Yes. Other questions?
Hi. There's a lot of interest in the Odyssey right now for some strange reason. There's The Return, there's the Christopher Nolan picture that's about to come out, and then there's a guy in New York who performs the Odyssey out of his apartment, and then there's another guy who does the entire thing on Spotify with songs and all kinds of other things. And so there seems to be interest in this. Having completely immersed yourself in this story, why do you think it is appealing to young people today and impacting our culture?
It's a great question. I didn't know about the guy in his apartment, I must say, but it certainly gives me hope for the future. I think it's funny. I'm in the middle of editing a piece I'm about to publish on this very subject, so you're getting a sneak preview. I think it's two things. So you mentioned young people. I think of the two Homeric poems, the Odyssey always appeals to young people, partly because of the adventure element. You know, it is one of the great adventure stories. And I you know, when we were chatting backstage in the green room, one of Bob's many accomplishments is that, was it your first book, that you wrote a book about the picaresque novel, right?
Yeah, that was my first
So
one.
the genre of the picaresque novel, where a sort of hapless hero bounces from adventure to adventure. You know, the Odyssey is appealing, I think, on the one hand, because of the adventure story, which is irresistible. And it, you know, unlike the Iliad, and this is always very interesting to me, it spawned many genres, right? There are so many genres of world literature that came out of the Odyssey, but not out of the Iliad. Science fiction, fantasy, the picaresque novel, right? The rom-com, I would even say, right? The hero and heroines, you know, separated frustratingly by all kinds of obstacles, and, you know, and so there's that. But I think that the reason suddenly it's on people's radars, right, other than the enormous anticipation about my translation, is we're in a post world, and the Odyssey is about postness, right? It's, remember, the Iliad is the great war story. The Odyssey, everything's over. The war is over. Everyone's gone home. The gods aren't that present in the Odyssey the way they were in the Iliad. You know, in the Iliad, they're all over there on the battlefield. They're helping their favorite. The Odyssey, they've sort of taken off. You feel that the Odyssey is about a moment in time where all the certainties of the old world have receded, and now there's this one guy and he's on his own. And I think that speaks to us, because we're certainly in a we're in a very post moment, right? And I have to think that's part of it. You know, it's the other interesting thing about the Odyssey is it has always felt modern in its whatever time people were reading it. Odysseus seems like a modern hero more than anyone in the Iliad, and I say that as someone who loves the Iliad, and the Iliad is certainly about very eternal things. But the Odyssey feels modern, you know, it anticipates the modernist hero in a lot of ways, a person, you know, scrambling to make it on his own in an uncertain universe. That's my gut feeling. You know, I'm excited about Christopher Nolan, because I think he could be the guy to get it right. And believe me, I speak as someone who has reviewed many terrible toga and sandal movies. But I think that has to do with it. It seems to speak to us, you know. There's somebody over there way on the side who raving a hand.
I'm gonna,
Okay.
I'm gonna come
Okay.
over there right after this one.
Is the pronunciation of ancient Greek a settled matter, and how can one be sure?
Is the pronunciation of ancient Greek a settled matter? No, although it's pretty settled. We know, you know, the ancient Greeks, just like us, had grammar books and, you know, how to read Greek books. And so we have a pretty good idea of what ancient Greek sounded like. Greek is one of the oldest language that has been continuously spoken, you know, for 3,500 years. It evolved a lot. Modern Greek sounds nothing like ancient Greek, although it is obviously derived from ancient Greek. But we do have a pretty good idea. One of the ways in which my translation is different from a lot of translations is I use the Greek spellings to sort of force you to see names that are familiar to us in the way that the Greeks saw them. So to take an obvious example, the witchy character who turns Odysseus's men into swine, at one point is a character we know as Circe, recently popularized by the internationally best-selling book by Madeline Miller. But the Greeks said her name Kirke, right? Because they spelled her name with K's. And when the Romans adapted Greek literature, they used the letter C because Latin doesn't have K. And the letter C in Latin was always hard, right? Weni, witty, wiki, right? Cicero, Caesar, not Caesar. So when they pronounced it, it was still Kirke, C-I-R-C-E. But, over the centuries and millennia, the C got soft, and we say Circe. So I'm putting all the K's back to sort of force you to have that spiky Greekness, which I like a lot. But we do have a pretty good idea of how it sounded.
Okay, we're going to take two more.
After you said that winged words are like arrows, I'm very curious. I have two questions. My first is I'm very curious what you think Odysseus would say about sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And then I was reading an essay of yours recently from a critic's manifesto, and you said in it that poetry was meant to show you how to live. So I'm very curious what you might have learned from Odysseus about how to live.
I'll take the easy one first. I don't think the arrows were meant to kill you. I think they just meant that the words were coming at you very fast. Well, I think another reason to come back to the question by the lady in the front row, I think we do learn from poetry, and the Odyssey is certainly about very human things. And as I get, as with all great works, your reading of them changes because you get older, and you keep going back to them at different stages in your life. And what I see now that the Odyssey is about is aging. I always tell my students, you cannot understand the Odyssey until you've been to your 20th high school reunion. Because it's about these two people who have been separated for such a long time that when they finally get back together, they struggle to recognize each other. And yet they have to prove to each other that they are the same person that they left behind 20 years ago. And that, to me, seems to get at one of the fundamental paradoxes of human existence. And I'll tell a story about my mother, so some of you know I wrote this book about how my father, at the age of 82, decided he wanted to be in my freshman Odyssey seminar. And that led to a lot of hijinks. And it just so happened that the year in which my dad was taking my class, which was a very funny experience, my mom turned 80, and on the day that I was teaching. And so before I went into the class, I quickly called my mom to say happy 80th birthday. And I said to her, Ma, how does it feel to be 80? And she said, I'll tell you how it feels to be 80. She says, every morning I wake up and I go into the bathroom to brush my teeth. And I look in the mirror and I say, who is this old woman looking at me? Because inside I feel the same as I've always felt. And that's what the Odyssey is about. The paradox that we feel to be us all through our lives, even though we know that we're changing. And yet, how do you resolve those things? So that the irony, which now strikes me as almost unbearably poignant about the end of the Odyssey, is Odysseus, who, as some of you know, he's a liar. He keeps making up stories about who he is, all these Bubbemeisters, and he's good at disguising himself. So now he has to prove that he's really him. and she doesn't believe him, right? And I thought that's what it's like to go to your 20th reunion, right? People come up to you and you're like, I dated you? Who is this old bald person, And I think that, so, I mean, the gadgets have changed, especially in this part of the country, the technology is better. But the problems have never changed. How do you know who you are, and how do you prove to other people who you are and that you're an authentic person? And that's what the Odyssey, one of the things that the Odyssey about. So I do think we learn from these works. They tell us true things about the world that have never changed, and by the way, will never change, because human nature will never change as good as our technology gets. So that's my answer. I think one more question.
One last question.
Okay.
And just a reminder that Daniel's going to be signing in the back of the hall immediately after the program.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my question. I'm particularly intrigued by the first line where you say, "Tell me the tale of a man." Is this because you want to talk about the tale? Or is this a word filler because the original is "Tell me about the man"?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Your first line, you say, "Tell me the tale of a man," whereas Andra moi enepe, musa polytropo. So it is about the muse telling about the man, not about the tale. And I found that interesting in a way that it gives me the sense that I'm going to read a story, whereas other translations give me the impression that I'm going to read about a man.
Well, the word enepa, since you obviously know the Greek, means to really, one way of translating it would be follow through me this man, right? So I thought it is one of the things that the Odyssey is about is people telling stories about their lives, right? Everyone, one of the other true things about life that the Odyssey tells you, everyone has a story. Even the guy who takes care of your pigs turns out to have been a prince in an earlier life, right? So it's very interested in narrative about one's life. But I think certainly it's about storytelling. And so because that imperative verb in the first line really means tell through me about this man, but the telling is certainly present, so I think that's why I wanted to do it. Also, the other thing is that the tell me the tale is an alliterative phrase, and as you know, also because you obviously know the Greek, the first line of the Odyssey is filled with the same repeated consonants, so it seemed to me to have a nice rhythm. So those were some of the things I was balancing in that translation. It's if I may say, complicated question.
I would like to add just a quick comment on what you said about human nature is the same. Now, sophisticated academic analysts have argued at various points that the self is a modern invention that's created by Protestant introspection or by industrialization or urbanization or something else. And I think the two bodies of literature that Daniel and I have worked on are a resounding refutation of that.
Yeah, right. There is certainly a thing as the self in both biblical and classical literature. I think that's pretty true. Some of these people need to get out of the house more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.